The world used to feel predictable. Adults repeated the same formula with almost religious devotion. Go to school, get good grades, find a stable job, work hard, save money, buy a house, retire at 65. It was presented as a universal pathway, a map carved into stone long before any of us were born. For decades, millions followed it without questioning, trusting institutions, governments, and the promise that security was waiting at the end. But something changed, quietly at first, then all at once. The system people believed in began to crack, not because individuals were lazy or irresponsible, but because the world itself rewrote its rules. In 1971, when the United States detached the dollar from the gold standard, money stopped being a store of value and became something entirely different, a form of debt. Suddenly, wealth was no longer tied to hard assets, but to decisions of central banks and governments. Trillions could be printed with a vote or a signature. The value of savings evaporated like morning mist. Yet despite this seismic shift, society kept teaching children the same outdated script. When Robert first realized this, he was sitting in a small classroom in Hawaii, staring at a chalkboard that promised a future of safety if he simply obeyed. His poor dad, a respected educator, believed deeply in the system. "Education is the key," he would say. "A steady paycheck is the safest path." He lived by those words until his final days. But Robert's rich dad, a man with no formal education but sharp intuition, would laugh whenever he heard such advice. "Why would you save money," he would say, "when the government is printing it faster than you can earn it? Why would you fight for job security in a world where jobs themselves are becoming obsolete?" Over time, Robert realized that the traditional formula didn't just fail, it trapped people. It trained them to depend on institutions that no longer had the power to protect them. It encouraged them to save a currency that was constantly losing value. It pushed them into debt for houses they believed were assets, and into retirement accounts controlled by markets they barely understood. But the strangest part wasn't how quickly the world changed. It was how slowly people accepted it. Millions continued to believe in the same instructions from the 1950s while the rules of economics were being rewritten right under their feet. Inflation rose, wages stagnated, job security vanished. Technology took more roles in a decade than humanity replaced in a century. People worked harder, saved more, and yet felt poorer every year. "Most people never check the expiration date on their beliefs," Robert's rich dad once said. "Their minds expire before their milk does." This idea haunted Robert. He watched friends graduate with honors, clutching diplomas like shields, only to discover that the job market didn't care. They accepted any paycheck they could find, believing their degree guaranteed success. But a degree no longer guaranteed anything. It merely guaranteed debt. The world was advancing at the speed of Moore's Law, technology doubling every 18 months, while the education system remained frozen in time. Students learned outdated theories from outdated books to enter an outdated economy. Robert understood something simple but uncomfortable. The traditional path doesn't fail because people aren't working hard enough. It fails because it belongs to a world that no longer exists. The gap between the rich and poor wasn't just financial, it was philosophical. It was the gap between those who adapted and those who clung to expired ideas. The rich studied money, the poor worked for it. The middle class chased safety, unaware that safety itself was disappearing. And while governments printed trillions to stimulate the economy, ordinary people felt the consequences. Savings accounts lost value. Retirement funds couldn't keep up with inflation. The price of homes skyrocketed beyond reach. Even the simple act of buying groceries became a reminder that yesterday's rules no longer applied. Robert's rich dad liked to say, "The world isn't getting worse. Your strategy is." And he was right. The first step toward understanding wealth wasn't learning new skills. It was questioning old beliefs. As Robert grew older, he realized that the greatest danger wasn't economic collapse, inflation, or market volatility. The greatest danger was trusting a map drawn for a landscape that no longer exists. Most people follow instructions instead of reality. They choose comfort over truth. They cling to old ideas because questioning them feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. But growth begins at that cliff. To move forward, Robert had to unlearn everything he was taught about money. He had to challenge the very foundation on which his childhood was built. And the more he questioned, the more clearly he saw. The system was never designed to make people rich. It was designed to make them obedient. In a world where money itself had transformed, where technology reshaped industries overnight, and where financial power shifted to those willing to understand the new rules, the old formula had only one guaranteed result. If you follow the old path, you end up exactly where everyone else is headed, struggling, confused, and wondering why doing everything right feels so wrong. Robert decided he wouldn't follow that path, and this decision became the beginning of an entirely different life. ChatGPT сказал, in every person, whether they realize it or not, three very different voices compete for control. These voices are not mystical or symbolic. They are psychological identities shaped by family, culture, fear, ambition, and the stories we've been told since childhood. Robert didn't understand this at first. He believed people were simply rich or poor based on opportunities or luck. But as he grew older and watched the people around him, he saw a pattern emerging, one that would influence every financial decision he ever made. The first voice was the poor self. This voice was loud, emotional, anxious, always preparing for the worst. It whispered warnings in moments of uncertainty. Be careful. Don't risk it. Hold on to what little you have. The poor self viewed the world as a dangerous place where any misstep could lead to disaster. It wasn't an evil voice. It was protective, but it was also suffocating. It taught people to avoid danger so intensely that they also avoided opportunity. Whenever Robert felt fear of losing money, of looking foolish, of trying something new, he recognized the poor self rising inside him, tightening its grip. The second voice was the middle-class self. This voice was calmer, more rational, and deceptively reassuring. It didn't crave wealth, it craved stability. It wanted a paycheck on time, a mortgage that felt respectable, a car that was leased but looked impressive. The middle-class self lived for the comfort of enough. It didn't dream of freedom, only security. It valued predictable routines, predictable income, predictable lives. And because society glorified this stability, the middle-class self often became the dominant voice for most people. It convinced them they were doing the smart thing, working hard, getting promoted, saving for retirement, while quietly trapping them inside a financial treadmill they could never escape. Then there was the rich self. This voice didn't scream or beg. It didn't settle for comfort. It thought differently. It asked questions instead of accepting answers. It wanted freedom more than safety. Where the poor self saw risk, the rich self saw potential. Where the middle-class self saw stability, the rich self saw stagnation. This voice recognized that wealth was not about income. It was about choices, control, and owning things that produced value. It didn't strive to be paid. It strived to create. It didn't wait for instructions. It built systems, assets, and opportunities. The remarkable thing was that all three voices lived inside Robert at the same time, and they live inside everyone else too. No one is born permanently poor or permanently wealthy. People simply learn to listen to one voice more than the others. Growing up, Robert's poor self dominated him. His father, the academic, unknowingly reinforced it with warnings about danger, responsibility, and caution. "Play it safe," he would say. "The world is uncertain." His middle-class self developed through school, where he was taught to follow directions, respect authority, and avoid mistakes at all costs. Every reward, good grades, praise from teachers, approval from adults, trained that middle-class voice to seek stability above everything else. But when he spent time with his rich dad, something shifted. The rich self inside him began to wake up. His rich dad didn't encourage recklessness, but he rejected the idea that fear or security should guide decisions. "Comfort is the enemy of progress," he would tell Robert. "The moment a paycheck becomes more important than your potential, you've surrendered your freedom." Robert learned that wealth wasn't a number, it was an identity. It lived in mindset long before it appeared in a bank account. He watched people lose money and crumble, not because the loss destroyed them, but because their identity wasn't built to handle adversity. He watched others lose even more, but come back stronger because their rich self wasn't tied to a particular job, business, or income. It was tied to resilience. The more Robert observed, the more he realized how silently these identities shaped people's futures. The poor self led people to fear opportunity. The middle-class self led them to trade their time for comfort. The rich self pushed them to grow even when it was painful. One of the most important lessons he learned was that the world does not reward the smartest or the most talented, only the most decisive. The poor self waits. The middle-class self hesitates. The rich self acts. Not recklessly, but boldly, fully aware that failure is part of the path, not the end of it. This internal conflict isn't a battle that ends, it is a lifelong negotiation. Even years later, when Robert became financially successful, he still felt the poor self tug on him during economic downturns. He still heard the middle-class self whisper when opportunities looked uncertain. The difference was that he no longer obeyed those voices. He recognized them, acknowledged them, and then chose differently. Because the voice you choose to follow determines the life you get. As Robert matured, this realization became the foundation of everything he taught. People don't become financially trapped because of money. They become trapped because they never learned to silence the part of themselves that clings to safety. And people don't become wealthy because of luck. They become wealthy because they cultivate the voice that pushes them beyond what is comfortable. The three selves live inside everyone, but only one of them leads to freedom. The moment Robert decided to walk away from a stable paycheck, he stepped into a world that most people never truly see. A world where safety disappears, excuses dissolve, and a person meets their real self for the first time. Becoming an entrepreneur wasn't a business decision. It was a transformation, a shedding of the identity he'd been trained to wear since childhood. And like every true transformation, it began with fear. He still remembered the day he received his last check at Xerox. It wasn't a paycheck, but a bonus. $30,000, more money than he had ever held at once. It should have felt like victory, but instead, he felt something unsettling, a mixture of excitement and dread. The check represented the end of certainty. From that moment on, no employer would shield him. No salary would save him. The safety net was officially gone. As he stared at the check, wondering what came next, a colleague approached him. His name was John, a man whose eyes carried the dull heaviness of someone who had tasted ambition but abandoned it. "You'll be back," John told him, almost casually. "You're going to fail. Everyone who leaves comes back." Robert felt heat rise in his chest, not anger, resolve. He looked straight into the man's eyes and said, "You failed and came back. I'll fail too. But I'm not coming back." That moment became a promise, a vow sealed not with certainty, but with determination. Entrepreneurship, he would learn, wasn't about confidence. It was about commitment, a commitment so strong that retreat was never an option. Leaving Xerox felt like taking the first step onto a long, narrow bridge with no rails, suspended over a canyon. Behind him was the familiar world of paychecks, supervisors, schedules, and predictable routines. Ahead lay the unknown, opportunity mixed with chaos, freedom wrapped in uncertainty. For the first time in his life, there was no salary arriving at the end of the month, no benefits package, no assurance that he would be able to pay rent. Days bled into nights as he tried idea after idea, some of them brilliant, others embarrassingly misguided. But each failure carved away a layer of fear. Each setback sharpened his instincts. His rich dad had prepared him for this. "A paycheck," he once said, "is a drug. It keeps you hooked on safety while numbing your potential." Robert finally understood what he meant. Without a paycheck, he became hungry, not just for money, but for clarity, strategy, and growth. Hunger forced him to learn faster than any school ever could. He discovered that entrepreneurship wasn't a career, it was a mirror. It showed him exactly who he was when comfort disappeared. It exposed every weakness, every insecurity, every excuse he had hidden behind. Some days, he questioned everything. Other days, he felt unstoppable, as if he were finally in alignment with what he was meant to do. He learned quickly that most people don't fail because the journey is too difficult. They fail because the comfort of returning to their old life is always waiting for them. Their family tells them it's safer. Their friends say it's more realistic. Their bosses promise stability. It becomes easy to surrender the dream and return to the paycheck. Robert had no such escape route. He had burned the bridges behind him. There were nights when he slept in cheap motels, counting every dollar he had left, wondering if he had made a colossal mistake. But each hardship became a lesson. Each mistake became a teacher. He didn't grow despite the struggle. He grew because of it. Slowly, he began to understand the truth his rich dad had been trying to teach him for years. Entrepreneurs are built, not born. They are shaped by pressure, tested by uncertainty, strengthened by failure. The difference between those who succeed and those who surrender isn't intelligence or luck, it's resilience. Robert realized that the world doesn't reward people who avoid mistakes. It rewards those who survive them. As time passed, he developed a new sense of identity. He no longer waited for permission to act. He no longer feared risking what little he had. The absence of a paycheck didn't weaken him. It hardened him. It turned him into someone who could think independently, make decisions under pressure, and trust in his own ability to create opportunities. Entrepreneurship wasn't glamorous. It wasn't about fancy offices or inspiring quotes. It was about enduring long stretches of uncertainty without losing hope. It was about listening to dozens of no's and still believing in one yes. It was about waking up every day with nothing guaranteed except the chance to try again. And through this process, Robert discovered the most important truth of all. Entrepreneurship isn't about business. It's about character. It reveals who you are when everything familiar is stripped away. It pushes you to grow beyond the limits you once believed were fixed. It teaches you to trust your inner voice instead of the voices of doubt around you. It forces you to rely on creativity, discipline, and courage rather than comfort. The journey didn't make Robert rich right away. In fact, for years he earned nothing. But something far more valuable was forming inside him, a mindset that couldn't be bought, taught, or inherited. The mindset of someone who refuses to return to an ordinary life. That mindset became the foundation of his success long before the money ever arrived. The first real turning point in Robert's understanding of wealth came when he realized that most people were playing the wrong game with money. They weren't failing because they lacked intelligence or discipline. They were failing because they were following rules designed for a world that no longer existed. And nowhere was this more obvious than in the way people viewed debt and taxes. From a young age, Robert had been taught the same lessons everyone else heard. Get out of debt, save money, buy a house, work your way up, pay your taxes responsibly. These ideas sounded noble, even responsible. They made people feel safe and righteous. But the more Robert studied how the wealthy actually lived, the more he understood a truth that felt almost forbidden. The rules that guide the poor and middle class are not the rules that create wealth. Debt, for most people, was a threat. It meant stress, collectors, sleepless nights, and financial chains that lasted decades. But to his rich dad, debt was a tool, sometimes dangerous, but always powerful when understood. There are two kinds of debt, he explained. Bad debt makes you weaker. Good debt makes you richer. Most people only ever encountered the first kind. They borrowed money to buy liabilities, car loans, credit cards, consumer purchases, mortgages on homes that didn't produce income. They spent years repaying money that never brought anything back. The wealthy, however, did the opposite. They borrowed against assets. They used the bank's money to buy properties, businesses, and investments that generated cash flow. Where the middle class viewed debt as a cage, the wealthy viewed it as leverage. Robert watched his rich dad refinance hundreds of millions in property, reducing interest rates and increasing cash flow. Every strategic decision made him wealthier, not poorer. Taxes followed the same pattern. Most people believed taxes were unavoidable, a permanent burden placed on workers. They assumed the government treated everyone equally. But Robert saw firsthand that the tax code was not written to punish the rich. It was written to reward certain behaviors. Entrepreneurs, real estate investors, and business owners lived under a completely different set of incentives. They received deductions, credits, depreciation, and benefits that full-time employees never enjoyed. One day, Robert spoke with a highly successful doctor who proudly told him he had finally earned $1 million in a year. But when Robert asked how much he'd paid in taxes, the doctor admitted, with visible frustration, that roughly 3/4 of that income went to the government. "I made $1 million," he said, "but I only kept a fraction of it." The man had spent years in school, taken on enormous student debt, and sacrificed most of his life for his career, only to discover that the system rewarded him less than someone who understood the rules of money. By contrast, when Robert earned $1 million, he kept nearly all of it. Not because he cheated the system, but because he understood the system. He reinvested his income into assets, used depreciation as a shield, and allowed passive income to flow through structures designed to minimize tax exposure. His money didn't just grow, it multiplied. He learned that wealthy people never work for money. They work to acquire assets that produce money. The middle class works for wages. The rich work for control. The poor trade time for income. The rich trade ideas for leverage. The entire system is built around a simple, uncomfortable truth. Employees pay the highest taxes, while those who create value pay the least. The more Robert studied these patterns, the more he realized how deeply the traditional narrative conditioned people to remain trapped. Schools taught students to be good workers, not good thinkers. Financial literacy was almost entirely absent from the curriculum. People were told to fear debt, avoid risk, and trust systems that quietly drained their potential. A house, for example, was considered the ultimate asset. Families went into deep debt believing it was a symbol of success. But the house didn't put money into their pockets. It took money out each month. The wealthy knew this. That's why they bought real estate that paid them, not buildings they had to pay for. They didn't chase status symbols, they chased cash flow. Over time, Robert began to see money not as something you earn, but as something you use. Money was a tool, a lever, a force. In the wrong hands, it created stress. In the right hands, it created freedom. Wealth wasn't about how much someone saved. It was about how well they understood the game. The rich didn't work harder, they worked smarter. They didn't fear taxes, they learned how to navigate them. They didn't avoid debt, they mastered it. The more he spoke to entrepreneurs around the world, the more he saw the same truth repeated. People weren't being held back by the economy. They were being held back by outdated beliefs about money. They didn't question the rules because questioning felt dangerous, even disrespectful. But the people who dared to ask why, who dared to look beneath the surface, discovered a world of opportunity hidden in plain sight. Robert learned that the financial world wasn't divided into rich and poor, it was divided into players and spectators. Most people watched the game from the sidelines, following advice that kept them safe but stagnant. The wealthy were on the field, using tools that others never bothered to learn. Debt, taxes, leverage, cash flow, ownership. These weren't secrets. They were simply ignored. And as Robert mastered them one by one, he realized that the greatest difference between the rich and everyone else wasn't money at all. It was understanding. The wealthy weren't lucky. They weren't special. They weren't chosen by fate. They were simply playing a game most people never realized they could play. The greatest lesson Robert ever learned did not come from a book, a seminar, or a financial mentor. It came from watching people, how they lived, how they reacted to pressure, how they handled fear, and how easily they surrendered control of their lives without ever realizing it. Over time, he understood something that would shape the rest of his journey. The real battlefield of wealth is not in the economy outside, but in the economy within. This final understanding did not arrive suddenly. It grew quietly, formed slowly through years of observation, failure, resilience, and reflection. It was a truth so simple and yet so overlooked that most people lived their entire lives unaware of it. But once Robert saw it, he could never unsee it. He realized that every person walks through life with two economies. The first one is external: markets, jobs, interest rates, inflation, recessions, political decisions, global events. This is the world people talk about daily, complain about constantly, and fear endlessly. It feels massive and uncontrollable, a force so big and unpredictable that it can crush dreams overnight. Most people spend their entire lives reacting to this outer world, blaming it for their struggles, crediting it for their successes, and believing that their fate is tied to factors outside their influence. But the second economy, the internal one, is the most powerful force a person will ever experience. It is the sum of their mindset, beliefs, habits, emotional discipline, courage, resilience, and ability to adapt. This economy determines how they interpret events, how they respond to failure, how they recover from setbacks, and how they perceive opportunities. It is entirely internal, yet it silently shapes every outcome in the external world. The poor have a fragile internal economy. Even small disruptions, a job loss, a market dip, an unexpected bill, shake them deeply. They see danger everywhere and possibility nowhere. When the external world trembles, their internal world collapses. Their fear multiplies, their decisions become reactive, and their progress freezes. The middle class has a slightly stronger internal economy, but still fragile. Their sense of stability comes from external structures: a paycheck, a job title, a retirement plan, a mortgage, predictable routines. As long as the outside world stays stable, they feel secure. But when it shifts, as it inevitably does, they experience panic. They were promised certainty, but live in a world that guarantees none. The rich, however, operate differently. Their external economy matters, but it does not define them. They move with confidence even during chaos because their internal economy is strong. They understand that markets rise and fall, industries evolve, currencies shift, and governments change policies. But inside, they remain steady. They adapt instead of crumble. They grow instead of retreat. They create instead of wait. Robert learned this firsthand through the cycles of his own life. He experienced periods of success followed by sudden failures, investments that soared and investments that collapsed, moments of abundance and moments of scarcity. But he noticed that every time he fell, he eventually rose higher. Not because the world became easier, but because he became stronger. Failures stopped being threats and became training grounds. Mistakes stopped being shameful and became data. Fear stopped being a signal to retreat and became a signal to prepare. He realized that the people who thrive are not those who avoid difficulty, but those who refuse to let difficulty diminish them. There was a moment, early in his entrepreneurial journey, when everything seemed ready to fall apart. He had no stable income, his business ideas were struggling, and the money he had saved was drying up. Many people in his position would have gone back to the safe path, returned to a job, accepted a paycheck, and told themselves they had tried. But Robert's rich dad had drilled a simple truth into him. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. And for Robert, freedom mattered more. During that dark period, he learned to discipline his internal economy. When fear rose, he pushed himself to act anyway. When doubt whispered, he answered with effort. When the world seemed to be shrinking, he stretched his imagination further. Each small act strengthened the inner muscles that would eventually allow him to withstand far greater storms. He met countless people along the way: employees, small business owners, struggling professionals, ambitious dreamers. They all faced similar challenges, but their outcomes varied wildly. The differences weren't in talent or opportunity, but in mindset. Two people could experience the same crisis. One saw devastation, the other saw a chance to reinvent themselves. Two people could receive the same opportunity. One froze, the other leaped. He learned that wealth is not built in the hands but in the mind long before it manifests externally. The power of the internal economy became even clearer as Robert began to mentor others. He saw people who had every advantage: good education, supportive families, comfortable incomes, yet remained stuck. And he saw others who started with nothing, but rose quickly because they refused to break under pressure. They had strong internal economies, stability not rooted in circumstance, but in character. He came to understand that the world's most successful entrepreneurs weren't special in any traditional sense. They weren't always the smartest, the most educated, or the most skilled. What they had was something much rarer: the ability to stay centered when the world around them fell apart. They could remain optimistic during recessions, creative during disruptions, and persistent during failures. While others panicked, they strategized. While others retreated, they advanced. This final insight became the cornerstone of Robert's philosophy. If you strengthen your internal economy, the external economy can never control your life. People lose jobs because they fear losing jobs. People run out of money because they fear money. People stay stuck because they fear mistakes. Fear creates the future they seek to avoid. But the entrepreneur, the true entrepreneur, understands that fear is only dangerous when ignored. When confronted, understood, and acted upon, fear becomes fuel. It sharpens instincts, increases awareness, and forces innovation. Pressure becomes energy. Risk becomes opportunity. Difficulty becomes advantage. The internal economy grows stronger with every challenge it survives. Roberts saw that the external world will always shift. Inflation rises, markets crash, industries transform, technologies replace jobs, governments change policies. But the person with a strong internal economy does not crumble. They observe, they adapt, they rise again and again, and eventually, they reach a point where wealth no longer intimidates them, failure no longer discourages them, and uncertainty no longer confuses them. They become the kind of person who can thrive in any environment, not because they control the world, but because they control themselves. This was the ultimate conclusion of Robert's journey. True wealth is internal first, external second. Money, assets, and investments come and go, but a strong internal economy stays with you for life. When you master it, no crisis can break you, no setback can stop you, and no opportunity can overwhelm you. You become resilient, adaptable, and powerful. And once you reach that point, you no longer fear the future. You begin to create it.